Deep in the Arizona Territory archives, buried beneath decades of dust and bureaucratic neglect, lies a sheriff's report dated October 15, 1876, that has never seen the light of day. The document describes the discovery of human remains in the root cellar of the abandoned Henley Ranch, 12 miles northeast of what would later become Phoenix. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the brutality of the murder, but what the investigating deputy wrote in his personal notes. The family ate him. They didn't know, but they ate him. For nearly 150 years, the descendants of those who knew the truth have kept this story buried, fearing the shame it would bring to their lineage. Before we continue with the story of Martha Henley and the most shocking family dinner in Arizona Territory history, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about frontier justice. The autumn of 1876 brought more than just cooler winds to the sprawling cattle ranches scattered across the Arizona Territory. The Henley Ranch sat like a brown scar against the endless desert landscape, its weathered buildings clustered around a main house that had seen better days. Samuel Henley had claimed this land during the territorial rush of 1863, when the promise of cattle money drew ambitious men westward with dreams bigger than their wallets. By 1876, those dreams had curdled into something bitter and mean. The ranch employed nearly 24 men during peak season, making it one of the larger operations in the valley. Samuel's brothers, Jacob and William, had followed him west in 1865, bringing their wives and children to form what Samuel proudly called a proper family enterprise. The Henley name carried weight in the scattered settlements, from the trading posts along the Salt River to the territorial capital in Tucson. Martha had arrived as Samuel's bride in the spring of 1869, a pale, quiet woman from Missouri whose family had died in a cholera outbreak. At 22, she possessed the kind of delicate beauty that photographed well, but wilted quickly under the harsh desert sun. The marriage had been arranged through correspondence, Samuel needing a wife to manage his household, Martha needing escape from the charity of distant relatives who made no secret of their burden. The early years had held promise. Martha proved capable with domestic duties, could read and write better than most frontier women, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed the neighboring ranchers' wives. Samuel, 10 years her senior, had been attentive enough during their courtship period. The problems began when the children failed to come. By 1872, the whispers had started. In a territory where large families meant survival and prosperity, a childless wife became a liability. The Henley men began to view Martha not as family, but as a failed investment. Samuel's attitude shifted from disappointed husband to resentful taskmaster. His brothers, taking cues from Samuel's treatment, began to regard her as little more than unpaid help. Martha's daily routine had evolved into a grinding cycle of cooking, cleaning, mending, and avoiding the increasingly sharp tongues and harder looks of the Henley clan. She rose before dawn to start the breakfast fires, spending her days scrubbing, washing, and preparing meals for sometimes 30 people when the seasonal workers were in residence. The ranch wives, Samuel's sisters-in-law Rebecca and Catherine, had initially offered friendship but gradually distanced themselves as Samuel's treatment of Martha grew harsher. The Arizona Territory in 1876 was still largely lawless despite territorial government efforts. The nearest sheriff resided in Tucson, over 60 miles away across dangerous desert. Most disputes were settled locally, by men with guns and strong opinions about right and wrong. Women had few rights and fewer options. Divorce was nearly impossible, and a woman alone in the territory faced prospects that ranged from dire to deadly. The cattle business had been struggling. A harsh winter followed by a brutal summer drought had decimated herds across the territory. Samuel's temper, never particularly stable, had grown explosive as financial pressures mounted. He drank more heavily, gambled at the quarterly cattle auctions, and brought home stories of neighboring ranchers who'd struck it rich while the Henley operation barely broke even. Martha absorbed the blame for everything from failed pregnancies to failed harvests. If the bread burned, it was because she was useless. If the cattle prices dropped, it was because God was punishing Samuel for his barren wife. The brothers echoed these sentiments, creating an atmosphere of constant criticism and casual cruelty that wore Martha down like water on stone. The territory's isolation compounded every problem. Mail came sporadically, visitors were rare, and the closest neighbors lived 8 miles away. Martha had no confidants, no allies, no escape routes. She existed in a bubble of masculine hostility, her world narrowed to the ranch buildings and the endless cycle of thankless labor. As 1876 progressed, Samuel's violence had escalated beyond mere verbal abuse. What had begun as rough handling during arguments had progressed to outright beatings. Martha learned to read the signs. The set of his shoulders when he'd been drinking, the particular way he looked at her when the ranch accounts weren't balancing, the dangerous silence that preceded his worst rages. The night of October 3rd, 1876, began like many others that autumn, with Samuel returning from the saloon in nearby Wickenburg, carrying the familiar combination of alcohol fumes and barely contained rage. The quarterly cattle auction had been a disaster. Prices were down nearly 40% from the previous year, and Samuel had watched neighboring ranchers celebrate deals, while his own stock attracted only lowball offers from opportunistic buyers. Martha was in the kitchen, cleaning the last of the supper dishes by lamplight, when she heard the heavy footsteps on the porch. She didn't look up as Samuel entered, focusing instead on the tin plate in her hands. Experience had taught her that direct eye contact during his drinking moods only provided an excuse for confrontation. "Worthless," Samuel muttered, his voice thick with whiskey and disappointment. "Absolutely worthless." Martha continued washing, her movements careful and quiet. Sometimes ignoring his initial provocations allowed the mood to pass. Sometimes, "You hear me talking to you?" Samuel's voice rose, taking on the dangerous edge she'd learned to fear. "I hear you, Samuel," Martha replied quietly, still not turning around. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Martha set down the plate and turned slowly. Samuel stood swaying slightly in the doorway, his face flushed with drink and anger. Behind him, she could see Jacob and William settling onto the porch with their own bottles, their wives having taken the children to bed hours earlier. 12 years, Samuel said, his words coming out in a slurred growl. 12 years I've kept you fed and housed. 12 years of nothing, no children, no luck. Nothing but a useless woman eating my food and wearing my clothes. Martha said nothing. She'd learned that responses only fueled his anger. The Henderson's wife, she's got 6 children. 6. The youngest, not even 2 years old. Mrs. Patterson, she's carrying her 8th. Samuel took a step closer, and Martha could smell the whiskey on his breath, mixed with the tobacco and sweat that always clung to his clothes. But my wife gives me nothing but empty rooms and empty hopes. Samuel, please, Martha whispered. The men can hear. Let them hear, Samuel roared, his hand suddenly striking out to grab Martha's wrist. Let them all hear about Samuel Henley's worthless wife. His grip was iron tight, and Martha gasped as his fingers dug into her flesh. Through the open door she could see Jacob and William watching with the casual interest of men observing a familiar show. You cost me money, you know that? Samuel's voice dropped to a hiss. No children means no extra hands, no sons to help with the ranch, no daughters to marry off for alliances. You're worse than useless, you're expensive useless. Martha tried to pull away, but Samuel's grip only tightened. Samuel, you're hurting me. Hurting you? Samuel laughed, a sound like broken glass. Lady, you don't know what hurt is, but maybe it's time you learned. The first blow caught Martha across the face with such force that she stumbled backward, her hip striking the edge of the kitchen table. The sharp corner sent a spike of pain through her side, but before she could recover, Samuel was on her again. This is for 12 years of disappointment, he snarled, his fist connecting with her ribs. This is for making me look like a fool in front of every rancher in the territory. Martha tried to shield herself with her arms, but Samuel was a big man made strong by years of ranch work. Each blow landed with devastating force, driving the air from her lungs and sending waves of agony through her body. "Samuel, stop," she gasped, tasting blood in her mouth. "Stop." Samuel grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back to look into his face. His eyes held a wild gleam that terrified her more than the physical pain. "I should have stopped 12 years ago. Should have left you in Missouri to rot with the rest of your worthless family." He released her hair only to backhand her across the mouth, the force of the blow splitting her lip and sending her sprawling to the floor. Martha lay there gasping, her vision blurred by tears and pain, dimly aware of laughter from the porch. "Look at her, boys," Samuel called out to his brothers. "Look at the great Martha Henley now." Through the doorway, Martha could see Jacob and William watching with amusement. Jacob raised his bottle in a mock toast. "Maybe now she'll learn her place, Sam. About time someone put her in it," William added, his laughter echoing in the desert night. Samuel looked down at Martha with disgust. "Get up," he ordered. Martha tried to rise, her movements slow and painful. Her ribs screamed with each breath, and she could feel blood trickling from her split lip. But she managed to get to her knees, then shakily to her feet. "That's better," Samuel said with satisfaction. "Now maybe you'll remember what happens when you disappoint me." But as Martha stood there, swaying and bleeding, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it, like a coal buried in ash, burned something else. Something that had been growing through 12 years of humiliation and abuse, fed by every cruel word and casual blow. Samuel turned away, apparently satisfied with the evening's work. He headed toward the door, probably planning to rejoin his brothers for more drinking and more stories about his useless wife. He never saw Martha's hand close around the handle of the carving knife that lay on the kitchen table. The blade was 8 inches of carbon steel, kept sharp for Sunday roasts and holiday preparations. It had carved countless meals for the Henley family, had been Martha's constant companion through years of domestic service. Now it felt different in her grip, not like a tool, but like an answer. "Samuel," Martha called softly. He turned, probably expecting another apology or plea. Instead, he found himself face to face with a woman he no longer recognized. Martha's swollen face was set in an expression of terrible calm, and the knife in her hand caught the lamplight like a promise. "Martha, what the hell?" Samuel began, but the words died in his throat as he finally understood what he was seeing. The moment stretched between them like a held breath. Samuel's alcohol-dulled reflexes fought to process the transformation before him. This wasn't the cowering woman he'd been beating for the past 12 years. This was something else entirely, something that made his drunk confidence evaporate like morning dew in the desert sun. "Put that down," Samuel said, his voice losing its earlier bluster. "Martha, put that knife down right now." But Martha didn't move. She stood there holding the blade, her swollen face a mask of years of accumulated rage, finally finding focus. Blood from her split lip had dripped onto her apron, creating small, dark stains that seemed to multiply in the flickering lamplight. 12 years, Martha said quietly, her voice steady despite her injuries. 12 years of your fists, 12 years of your brother's laughter, 12 years of being told I'm worthless. Now, Martha, you're upset. I understand that, but do you? Martha interrupted, taking a small step forward. The knife remained steady in her grip. Do you understand what it's like to wake up every morning knowing that the people who are supposed to care for you see you as nothing more than an object to blame for their failures? Samuel's eyes darted toward the door, where his brothers' voices could still be heard. But something in Martha's expression warned him against calling for help. This felt like a moment balanced on a knife's edge, literally, and any sudden movement might tip it toward violence. I've been a good wife, Martha continued, her voice growing stronger. I've cooked your meals, cleaned your house, mended your clothes, and never once complained about the life you've given me. And what have I gotten in return? Martha, please. What have I gotten, Samuel? Martha's voice rose, and for the first time in 12 years, it was Samuel who looked afraid. The sounds from the porch had grown quieter, as if Jacob and William sensed something changing in the atmosphere. The desert night pressed in around the ranch buildings, vast and empty and indifferent to human suffering. Samuel licked his lips nervously. "Look, maybe I was a little rough tonight, but you know how the business has been. The pressure." "The pressure," Martha repeated flatly. "Your pressure, your problems, your disappointments, and somehow they all become my fault, don't they?" She took another step forward, and Samuel instinctively backed up. "The cattle prices drop. It's because God is punishing you for your barren wife. The crops fail. It's because I bring bad luck. Your brothers need someone to mock. Well, Martha's an easy target." "That's not—" "I never said—" "You didn't have to say it, Samuel. You showed me every day with your fists and your words and your casual cruelty. You showed me exactly what you think I'm worth." The knife caught the light again as Martha adjusted her grip. Samuel's eyes were fixed on the blade, his mind trying to calculate distances and possibilities. But years of drinking had slowed his reflexes, and Martha was closer than was comfortable. "What do you want?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Samuel had ever seen. It was the smile of someone who had finally found clarity after years of confusion, purpose after years of aimless suffering. "I want to show you what worthless really looks like," she said. What happened next took less than 5 seconds, but those seconds would haunt the Arizona territory for generations. Samuel, finally realizing the genuine danger he was in, lunged forward to grab the knife. But 12 years of ranch work had made Martha stronger than she looked, and 12 years of abuse had given her motivation that Samuel couldn't match. The blade found its mark with surgical precision, sliding between Samuel's ribs and into his heart with barely a sound. His eyes went wide with shock, then confusion, then nothing at all. He dropped to his knees, then forward onto his face, his body making a soft thud against the kitchen floor. Martha stood over him for a long moment, the bloody knife still in her hand, listening to the silence that had suddenly fallen over the ranch. The voices from the porch had stopped entirely. Perhaps Jacob and William had heard something, or perhaps they were simply lost in their own drunken conversation. Either way, Martha knew she had only minutes before someone came looking. She knelt beside Samuel's body, her mind racing with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The fear was gone. The constant anxiety that had been her companion for so long had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly focused. Samuel was dead, and she had killed him. In the Arizona territory of 1876, that meant she would hang if caught. But as Martha looked down at her husband's lifeless form, she realized she felt no remorse, only a profound sense of completion. This was always how it was going to end. She could see that now with perfect clarity. The question was what to do next. Martha moved quickly and quietly, her domestic skills serving her well in this strangest of tasks. She dragged Samuel's body toward the root cellar entrance, using an old quilt to muffle any sounds. The cellar was cool and dark, perfect for preserving meat during the hot Arizona summers. It would serve equally well for preserving evidence. As she worked, Martha's mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning and calculating with the same methodical approach she'd always brought to meal preparation. Samuel's brothers would expect to see him in the morning. They'd ask questions if he was missing. But what if he wasn't missing? What if he was simply elsewhere? A plan began to form in Martha's mind, brilliant in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. She looked at Samuel's body, then at the large cutting block where she'd prepared countless meals for the Henley family. For the first time in 12 years, Martha Henley smiled with genuine happiness. The brothers would learn what worthless really meant. They would all learn. Dawn came slowly to the Arizona territory on October 4th, 1876, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and orange that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Martha had not slept. She'd spent the dark hours before sunrise working with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that her life depended on attention to detail. Samuel's body lay in the root cellar, carefully wrapped and positioned. Martha had cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, mopping every trace of blood and ensuring that nothing remained to suggest violence had occurred. To any casual observer, it would appear that Samuel had simply retired to bed after his drinking session with his brothers. But Martha's work was far from finished. The most challenging part lay ahead. She began her preparations at first light, starting with the large stock pot that she normally used for cooking stews for the ranch hands. The pot was black iron, seasoned with years of use and large enough to serve 30 men. Today it would serve a different purpose entirely. Martha built up the fire in the kitchen stove, feeding it with oak logs that would burn hot and clean. The temperature needed to be perfect, hot enough for her purposes, but not so hot as to attract unwanted attention from anyone passing near the kitchen. She worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had managed a ranch kitchen for over a decade. From the root cellar, she retrieved what she needed, carrying it in manageable portions. Her domestic skills, honed by years of preparing game that Samuel and his brothers brought back from hunting trips, served her well. She'd butchered deer, elk, and wild boar. The technique was the same, only the stakes were infinitely higher. Martha worked methodically, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. She separated usable portions from waste, setting aside what could be prepared and disposing of what could not. The bone and gristle went into burlap sacks that she would later bury in the desert. The usable meat went into the preparation area she'd set up on the kitchen's main work table. By mid-morning, Jacob and William were stirring in their beds, no doubt nursing hangovers from the previous night's drinking. Martha could hear movement from their rooms, the familiar sounds of the Henley men beginning another day. Soon they would be looking for breakfast, and they would ask about Samuel. Martha was ready for them. She had prepared a story as carefully as she'd prepared everything else. Samuel had risen early, she would tell them, complaining of restlessness after the disappointing cattle auction. He'd announced his intention to ride into Wickenburg to speak with other ranchers about pooling resources for a trip to the California markets. Such a journey would take several days, possibly longer if he decided to continue to San Francisco to investigate Pacific shipping options. The story was plausible because it contained elements of truth. Samuel had indeed been frustrated by the local cattle prices, and he had mentioned the possibility of seeking alternative markets. The Henley brothers would find nothing suspicious about Samuel taking off on a business venture without much notice. It was exactly the kind of impulsive decision their older brother was known for. "Where's Sam?" Jacob asked as he entered the kitchen, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot. Martha was standing at the stove, stirring the contents of the large pot. The smell of cooking meat filled the kitchen, rich and savory. She'd added onions, herbs, and spices to create a stew that would mask any unfamiliar flavors. "He left before dawn," Martha replied without turning around. "Rode out toward Wickenburg, something about the cattle prices." William appeared in the doorway, looking equally worse for wear. "Left? Without saying anything? You know how he gets when he's got business on his mind," Martha said, ladling the stew into bowls. "Said he might be gone a week or more, something about California buyers." The brothers exchanged glances, but seemed to accept the explanation. Samuel's mercurial nature was legendary, and his business dealings often took unexpected turns. They settled at the kitchen table, grateful for hot food and strong coffee to combat their hangovers. "This is good," Jacob said after tasting the stew. "What kind of meat is this?" Martha felt her heart skip a beat, but her voice remained steady. "Wild boar," she said. "Samuel brought it back from that hunting trip last month. I've been saving it in the root cellar." "Doesn't taste like boar," William observed, taking another spoonful. "I prepared it differently this time," Martha replied. "Used some new spices I got from that traveling merchant. Thought it might improve the flavor." The brothers seemed satisfied with this explanation and continued eating. Martha busied herself with cleaning. fighting to keep her hands steady as she watched Samuel's brothers consume their morning meal with obvious enjoyment. "Sam say when he'd be back?" Jacob asked. He wasn't sure. Depends on what he finds in California. Could be 2 weeks, could be longer. This news didn't seem to trouble the brothers particularly. Samuel often left them to manage ranch operations while he pursued various business schemes. They were accustomed to his absences and capable of handling the day-to-day work without supervision. Martha served them second helpings, ensuring they ate their fill before clearing the table. She disposed of the leftover stew by claiming she would save it for the evening meal, but in reality, she buried it deep in the desert where scavengers would make quick work of any evidence. Over the following days, Martha maintained the fiction of Samuel's absence with careful attention to detail. She intercepted the mail, claiming that Samuel had instructed her to handle correspondence while he was away. She deflected questions from neighboring ranchers by explaining that Samuel was exploring new business opportunities in California. The deception was made easier by Samuel's own reputation for impulsive business ventures and extended absences. The Arizona Territory in 1876 was a place where men often disappeared for weeks at a time, chasing opportunities or avoiding debts. Samuel's absence, while notable, was not unprecedented. But Martha knew that the deception could not last indefinitely. Eventually, people would begin asking harder questions. Eventually, someone would want to verify Samuel's whereabouts or would expect him to return from his mysterious California venture. Martha used this time to plan her escape. She began gathering supplies for a long journey, taking small amounts each day to avoid suspicion. She studied Samuel's maps of the territory, identifying routes that would take her away from populated areas and toward the Mexican border. The irony was not lost on her. For 12 years, she had been trapped on the Henley Ranch, isolated and powerless. Now, having committed the ultimate act of rebellion, she was finally free to leave. The question was whether she would be able to get far enough away before someone discovered the truth. Meanwhile, Jacob and William continued to manage the ranch operations, apparently unconcerned by their brother's absence. They seemed, if anything, relieved to be free of Samuel's volatile temper and constant criticism. The ranch ran more smoothly without his unpredictable interference. Martha watched them work, these men who had tormented her for so many years, and felt a cold satisfaction. They had no idea that they were living in a house where their brother had died violently. They had no idea that they had consumed his flesh with apparent enjoyment. They had no idea that the meek, worthless woman they had abused for over a decade was capable of such calculated revenge. But Martha knew that her time was running out. She needed to execute the final phase of her plan before suspicion began to grow. And that phase would require one more family meal, one that would ensure the truth of what had happened would haunt the surviving Henley brothers for the rest of their lives. 2 weeks after Samuel's disappearance, Martha began preparing for what she knew would be her final dinner at the Henley Ranch. The date was October 17th, 1876, and the autumn air carried the first hints of the harsh winter to come. The seasonal ranch hands had been paid and sent away until spring, leaving only the core family members. Jacob, William, their wives Rebecca and Catherine, and their combined 6 children. Martha had been planning this evening carefully, waiting for the right moment when everyone would be together and relaxed. She'd announced earlier that day that she wanted to prepare a special Sunday dinner to celebrate the successful completion of the fall roundup. The family had gathered in the main dining room, a rare occurrence that Samuel had typically reserved for holidays and special occasions. "This is quite a feast, Martha," Rebecca said, surveying the elaborate spread that Martha had prepared. The table groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables from the kitchen garden, and even an apple pie made from fruit she'd preserved earlier in the season. "I wanted to do something special," Martha replied, her voice carrying none of the nervous tension she felt inside. "With Samuel away on business, I thought we should take time to appreciate what we have here." Catherine nodded approvingly. "It's been too quiet," without Sam's voice booming through the house. This feels more like a proper family gathering. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 15, chattered excitedly about the unusual bounty. Ranch life typically meant simple meals focused on sustenance rather than flavor. Martha's elaborate dinner was a welcome departure from their usual fare. Jacob carved the roast, a large cut of meat that Martha had prepared with particular care. She'd seasoned it with herbs from her garden and cooked it slowly to ensure tenderness. The meat was dark and rich, with a flavor that was somehow both familiar and unusual. "What kind of meat is this?" William asked, taking his second helping. "It's excellent, but I can't quite place it." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression remained serene. "It's from that last hunting trip Samuel took," she said smoothly. "He brought back more game than we could eat fresh, so I've been preserving it. This cut has been aging in the root cellar." "Well, whatever it is, it's delicious," Jacob declared, cutting another piece for himself. Sam always was a good hunter. The conversation flowed around the table, touching on ranch business, plans for the winter months, and speculation about Samuel's extended absence in California. Martha participated just enough to avoid suspicion, but mostly she sat quietly, watching the Henley family consume their meal with obvious enjoyment. Young Thomas, Jacob's eldest son at 15, was particularly enthusiastic about the roast. "Aunt Martha, this is the best meat I've ever tasted. What's your secret?" Martha smiled at the boy, feeling an unexpected pang of something that might have been guilt. Thomas had always been kind to her, unlike his father and uncle. He didn't deserve to be part of what was happening. None of the children did. "Sometimes the secret is in how long you wait," Martha replied cryptically. "Good things come to those who are patient." As the evening progressed, Martha found herself studying each face around the table, memorizing details she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. These people had been her family for 12 years, the only family she'd had since leaving Missouri. They had also been her tormentors, her judges, and her jailers. Rebecca and Catherine, who had initially welcomed her as a sister-in-law, had gradually grown cold as Samuel's treatment of her worsened. They'd never directly participated in the abuse, but they'd never spoken against it either. Their silence had been its own form of cruelty. The children were innocent of their parents' sins, but Martha knew they were learning to treat her with the same casual disrespect they observed in the adults. Already, she could see young Thomas beginning to adopt his father's dismissive attitude toward women. The pattern would continue unless something broke it. "Martha," Jacob said, drawing her from her thoughts, "this has been wonderful, but we should probably discuss what happens if Sam's trip runs longer than expected. Winter's coming, and we'll need to make decisions about supplies and staffing." "Of course," Martha replied, "though I suspect Samuel will be back soon. His business ventures rarely keep him away for more than a month." "Still," William interjected, "we should be prepared. Maybe send someone to Wickenburg to ask around, see if anyone's heard from him." Martha nodded as if this were a reasonable suggestion, though internally she felt the first stirrings of panic. Any serious investigation into Samuel's whereabouts would quickly reveal that he'd never arrived in Wickenburg, let alone continued to California. She was running out of time. "That's wise," she said. "Perhaps after we finish with the dinner cleanup, we could discuss it further." But Martha had no intention of participating in any such discussion. After dinner, she would disappear into the desert night, leaving behind a letter that would explain everything the Henley family needed to know about their final meal together. She'd already written the letter, sealing it in an envelope and placing it where it would be found after her departure. The words had been chosen carefully, calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage while providing enough truth to satisfy any official investigation. As the family continued their meal, laughing and talking around the table, Martha excused herself periodically to check on the kitchen. During these brief absences, she gathered the supplies she'd hidden for her escape: water, dried food, warm clothing, and what little money she'd been able to save over the years. Her horse was saddled and waiting in a grove of mesquite trees a half-mile from the ranch house. She'd moved her supplies there earlier in the day, piece by piece, ensuring that everything was ready for a quick departure. "Martha, you've outdone yourself," Catherine called from the dining room. "This meal is absolutely wonderful. The children are already asking if you'll make it again." "I'm so glad you're enjoying it," Martha called back, securing her traveling pack and checking the contents one final time. Everything was there. Food, water, clothes, money, and the small pistol she'd taken from Samuel's gun cabinet. The weapon was loaded and ready, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. Martha returned to the dining room for the final time, accepting compliments on the meal and helping to clear the table. She moved normally, giving no indication that this would be the last time she would ever see these people or this place. "Well," Jacob said, patting his stomach contentedly, "that was certainly worth celebrating. What do you think, everyone? Should we make this a monthly tradition?" The family murmured agreement, already making plans for future gatherings. Martha smiled and nodded, playing her role perfectly, while her mind focused on the journey ahead. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Henley Ranch intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of frontier justice gone terribly wrong. As the family settled into the parlor for after-dinner conversation, Martha quietly slipped away to her room. She changed into her traveling clothes, dark, practical garments suitable for a long desert journey. She pinned her hair back tightly and secured her few precious possessions in the hidden pockets she'd sewn into her coat. The envelope containing her confession lay on the kitchen table, propped against the coffee tin, where someone would be sure to find it in the morning. Martha had written it in her careful script, explaining everything from Samuel's years of abuse to the exact contents of tonight's dinner. The surviving family members would know exactly what they had consumed and why. Martha took one last look around the kitchen where she'd spent so much of her life. 12 years of meals prepared at this stove, 12 years of dishes washed at this sink, 12 years of dreams slowly dying in this room. Now it would become the center of a nightmare that would haunt the Henley family forever. She could hear voices from the parlor, relaxed and happy after the excellent dinner. They had no idea that their world was about to change forever. They had no idea that the woman they'd dismissed as worthless had just served them the most memorable meal of their lives. Martha slipped out the kitchen door and into the desert night, walking quickly toward the grove where her horse waited. Behind her, the Henley Ranch glowed with warm lamplight, looking peaceful and prosperous in the darkness. Soon it would become a place of horror and shame, a name whispered in fearful tones throughout the Arizona territory. As she mounted her horse and turned toward the Mexican border, Martha allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. She had finally shown the Henley family what worthless really looked like. She had finally made them understand the true cost of their cruelty. The desert stretched endlessly before her, vast and unforgiving, but offering the one thing she'd been denied for 12 years: freedom. Martha rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the ranch before dawn would bring discovery of her disappearance. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, bathed in silver moonlight that cast strange shadows among the saguaro cacti and rocky outcroppings. Her horse was strong and sure-footed, having been chosen specifically for this moment months ago. By sunrise on October 18th, she was nearly 20 miles south of the ranch, following old Indian trails that would be difficult for pursuers to track. Martha had studied these routes carefully, knowing that her survival depended on reaching the Mexican border before anyone discovered what she had done. Back at the ranch, the day began normally enough. Jacob and William rose with the sun, as was their custom, expecting to find breakfast waiting in the kitchen. Instead, they found an empty stove and no sign of Martha. "Martha," Jacob called, his voice echoing through the silent house. "Where's breakfast?" There was no response. William checked Martha's room and found it empty, her bed unslept in. Her traveling clothes were missing from the wardrobe, along with her few personal possessions. "She's gone," William announced, returning to the kitchen with a grim expression. Took her things and left sometime during the night. Jacob scratched his head, more puzzled than concerned. That's strange. Where would she go? She's got no family, no money to speak of. Maybe she finally got tired of waiting for Sam to come back, William suggested. Women get notions sometimes, especially when they're left alone too long. It was Rebecca who found the letter. She'd come to the kitchen looking for coffee and noticed the envelope propped against the tin. Her name was written on the front in Martha's precise handwriting, along with the words, "To the Henley family." "Jacob, William," she called, her voice carrying an odd note of tension. "You need to see this." The brothers gathered around as Rebecca opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was several pages long, written in Martha's careful script. Jacob, the more literate of the two brothers, took the pages and began to read aloud. "My dear family," he read, then stopped abruptly, his face going pale. "What is it?" William demanded. "What does it say?" Jacob's hands were shaking as he continued reading, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "By the time you read this, I will be far from the ranch, never to return. I feel I owe you an explanation for my sudden departure and for certain events that have transpired in recent weeks." Catherine had joined them now, drawn by the tension in the room. The children remained in the parlor, unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. "Samuel did not go to California." Jacob continued reading, his voice growing hoarse. "Samuel will never go anywhere again. On the night of October 3rd, after years of abuse and degradation at his hands and yours, I killed my husband in this very kitchen." Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. William grabbed the letter from Jacob's shaking fingers, scanning the words with growing horror. "This can't be. She can't mean." William's voice trailed off as he read further. The letter detailed everything. The beating that had finally pushed Martha beyond endurance, the careful disposal of Samuel's body, the methodical preparation that had followed. But it was the final paragraph that would haunt the surviving family members for the rest of their lives. "The roast you enjoyed so thoroughly at last night's dinner," William read in a strangled voice, "was prepared from Samuel's remains. You have consumed your brother, your husband, your father. You told me I was worthless for 12 years. I wanted to show you what worthless truly means. You treated me like an animal, so I treated Samuel like one. May you remember the taste for the rest of your lives. Martha Henley." The letter dropped from William's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the kitchen floor like a dead bird. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the ticking of the mantel clock and Rebecca's sharp, panicked breathing. Then Catherine began to retch. She made it to the sink before her stomach emptied itself violently, the remnants of last night's dinner spattering against the basin. The sound triggered a chain reaction. Rebecca followed suit, then William, their bodies rejecting the knowledge of what they had consumed, even as their minds struggled to process the horror. Jacob stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and revulsion. Of all the brothers, he had been the most vocal in his criticism of Martha, the most creative in his cruelties. Now, the full weight of her revenge was settling on him like a physical blow. Young Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sounds of distress. "Pa, what's wrong? What's happening? What's—" Jacob turned to his son, and Thomas stepped back in alarm at the wild look in his father's eyes. How could he explain this to his children? How could he tell them that they had eaten their uncle, that the woman who had cooked their meals for years had served them human flesh? "Get the children," Jacob said hoarsely to his wife. "Get them out of this house. Now." "But Jacob, what? Now?" Jacob roared, his composure finally cracking completely. Rebecca hurried from the room, gathering the confused children and shepherding them toward the door. Their questions went unanswered as the adults struggled to cope with the magnitude of what they had learned. William was the first to regain some semblance of control. "We have to find Samuel's body," he said, his voice hollow. We have to bury him properly." The search of the ranch buildings began immediately. They started with the root cellar, where Martha had indicated she'd hidden the remains. What they found there would provide the final, horrifying confirmation of Martha's confession. Wrapped in old quilts and stored like sides of beef, they discovered what was left of Samuel Henley. The body had been systematically butchered with the skill of someone intimately familiar with meat preparation. The missing portions corresponded exactly with what the family had consumed over the previous 2 weeks. Jacob vomited again at the sight, his body convulsing with a combination of physical revulsion and psychological trauma. William fared little better, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his brother's remains. "Dear God," William whispered. "What kind of monster was she?" But even as he spoke the words, William knew the answer. Martha hadn't been born a monster. She'd been created by years of systematic cruelty and abuse. The Henley family had made her into something capable of unspeakable revenge, and now they were reaping what they had sown. The implications of the discovery were staggering. They would have to contact the territorial authorities, report Samuel's murder, and explain how his killer had escaped into the desert. But more immediately, they faced the psychological devastation of knowing what they had done. The children would have to be told something, though perhaps not the full truth. The neighbors would ask questions that would be impossible to answer honestly. The Henley name, once respected throughout the territory, would become associated with horror and shame. But perhaps most crushing of all was the knowledge that Martha's revenge was perfect in its completeness. She had not simply killed Samuel. She had forced his family to participate unwittingly in the desecration of his body. She had made them accomplices in their own degradation. As the sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, the full scope of Martha's vengeance became clear. She had not just murdered her abusive husband. She had destroyed the entire Henley legacy with surgical precision. The family would never recover from this blow, never escape the knowledge of what they had consumed in their moment of familial celebration. Meanwhile, somewhere in the vast desert, Martha Henley rode toward freedom with the satisfaction of a job completed perfectly. She had shown them what worthless really meant, and they would carry that knowledge with them to their graves. The official investigation into Samuel Henley's disappearance began 3 days later, when Jacob finally worked up the courage to ride to Wickenburg and contact the territorial marshal. Deputy Marshal Harrison Clark was a weathered man in his 50s who had seen enough frontier violence to be surprised by very little, but even he was shaken by what he found at the Henley Ranch. Clark's official report, filed on October 23, 1876, provides the only surviving legal documentation of the case. The deputy wrote in careful professional language about discovering human remains in the ranch's root cellar, evidence of systematic butchering, and a written confession from the suspected perpetrator. What he did not include in his official report was his personal observation that the surviving family members appeared to be suffering from severe psychological trauma beyond what would be expected from simply discovering a murder. "They can't eat," Clark wrote in a private letter to his wife. "Any of them. They've lost weight something terrible in just the few days since it happened. The women can barely speak, and the men jump at shadows. It's like they've seen something that broke their minds." The manhunt for Martha Henley was extensive, but ultimately futile. Tracking parties followed her trail for nearly 100 miles south before losing it in the rocky terrain near the Mexican border. The consensus among the searchers was that Martha had either died in the desert or successfully crossed into Mexico, where territorial law could not reach her. Local newspapers covered the story with varying degrees of sensationalism. The Arizona Weekly Miner ran a headline reading, "Rancher's wife murders husband, flees to Mexico," but provided few details about the specific nature of Martha's revenge. The more salacious details were considered too disturbing for publication and were shared only in whispered conversations in saloons and general stores. The Henley family never recovered from the trauma. Jacob sold the ranch for a fraction of its value 6 months later, using the money to relocate his family to Oregon. William followed suit, moving his wife and children to California. Neither brother ever spoke publicly about what had happened, and both families changed their surnames within a year of leaving Arizona. The ranch itself stood empty for several years before being purchased by a cattle company from Texas. The new owners tore down the original buildings and constructed new ones, but local superstition ensured that the property never again housed a family. It remained a commercial operation, staffed by seasonal workers who were not told about the land's history. Martha Henley was never seen again in the Arizona Territory. Various sightings were reported over the years, a woman matching her description working as a seamstress in Tucson, another running a boarding house in Tombstone, but none were ever confirmed. The official conclusion was that she had died in the desert during her flight, though her body was never found. However, there exists one tantalizing piece of evidence that suggests Martha may have survived her escape. In 1889, 13 years after the murders, a package arrived at the Wickenburg post office addressed to the people of Arizona Territory. Inside was a daguerreotype photograph of a middle-aged woman standing in front of what appeared to be a small house or shop. On the back, written in a familiar hand, were the words, "Some things are worth the wait. M.H." The photograph was turned over to territorial authorities, but by then the case was considered closed, and the surviving Henley family members had long since disappeared into anonymity. The image was filed away and eventually lost, leaving only a brief mention in the postal records to suggest that Martha Henley might have lived to see the new century. The psychological impact of Martha's revenge extended far beyond the immediate family. Word of what had happened spread throughout the territory, despite efforts to suppress the details, creating a cautionary tale that influenced how frontier families treated their women. Several documented cases exist of abusive husbands being confronted by neighbors or local authorities with warnings about ending up like Samuel Henley. The case also had a lasting impact on territorial law enforcement. New protocols were established for investigating domestic violence, and several jurisdictions began appointing women as informal advocates for wives in troubled marriages. While these changes came too late to help Martha, they represented a recognition that the existing system had failed catastrophically. Dr. Margaret Steinberg, a researcher at Arizona State University who studied frontier domestic violence in the 1960s, wrote extensively about the Henley case. In her 1967 book, Hidden Violence, Women and the Western Frontier, she argued that Martha's extreme response was the inevitable result of a system that provided no legal recourse for abused women. Martha Henley was not born evil, Dr. Steinberg wrote. She was created by a society that valued cattle more than women, that considered wives property rather than people. Her revenge was horrific, but it was also perfectly calculated to exploit the deepest fears and taboos of the culture that had brutalized her. The ranch property changed hands several more times over the decades, eventually becoming part of a larger development as Phoenix expanded into the surrounding desert. Today, the location where the Henley Ranch once stood is occupied by a shopping center, its tragic history unknown to the thousands of people who pass through daily. But in the archives of the Arizona Historical Society, carefully preserved in acid-free folders, the original documents from the case remain available to researchers. Deputy Marshal Clark's reports, the few surviving newspaper accounts, and even a copy of Martha's confession letter provide a window into one of the most disturbing crimes in territorial history. The letter itself makes for chilling reading even today, more than 140 years after it was written. Martha's precise handwriting and calm tone create a stark contrast with the horrific acts she describes. Her final words, in particular, continue to resonate with anyone who reads them. I spent 12 years learning what it meant to be worthless in the eyes of those who claimed to love me. I wanted to teach them the same lesson, to show them how it feels to discover that something they valued was actually worthless all along. They valued their family bonds, their shared meals, their masculine pride. I made all of those things worthless with a single dinner. Now they know how I felt every day for 12 years. The Henley case remains unique in the annals of American crime, not just for its shocking nature, but for the methodical way Martha planned and executed her revenge. Unlike crimes of passion or desperation, Martha's actions showed a level of premeditation and psychological sophistication that was almost unprecedented for the time period. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the perfect symmetry of Martha's revenge. She had been treated as less than human for 12 years, so she literally reduced her husband to meat. She had been told she was worthless, so she made the family's most precious bonds, their shared meals and family gatherings, worthless through contamination. She had been powerless, so she claimed the ultimate power over life and death. This mystery shows us that even in the harsh frontier environment of 1876, where violence was common and justice often rough, some acts were so calculated and cruel that they transcended ordinary understanding of right and wrong. Martha Henley's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the human capacity for both cruelty and retribution. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Martha's actions were justified by the abuse she suffered, or did her revenge cross a line that should never be crossed regardless of provocation? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this disturbing chapter in Arizona Territory history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that explore the dark side of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. The frontier was a place where ordinary people were pushed to extraordinary extremes, and Martha Henley's story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation is the one who has nothing left to lose. See you in the next video.